plethora of questions that have built up. We want to get to as many as possible. Okay, so somebody wrote in and said it's their first time here. My son, who is 2, has had the diagnosis for about 4 months, which I love to hear when families are getting these early diagnoses. Lately, I have been very distressed. My son ran into the street and he almost always doesn't recognize danger. I was wondering, is this aspect of not recognizing danger going to be something to worry about for the rest of his life? He has a diagnosis of PDD-NOS.
No, it's not. It's definitely not going to be something you're going to worry about forever. Danger is actually, watching out for danger, or what we call safety lessons, is very, very easy to do. It's, if you go back, actually, Shannon, interesting, like the very, very beginning of kind of an area of psychology that influenced us very much. We always talk about how all of our work in ABA goes back to Skinner, and before Skinner goes back to Thorndike, who came up with the whole concept of operant conditioning. But also there was another psychologist called Watson, and his whole idea was about conditioning and how you can change. His theory was that he used to say that I could take any child and turn them into anything. I could, if you give me a child from the time they're born, I can make sure that child becomes either a murderer or a philosopher, scientist, whatever. Wow. And one of the experiments that he had done was that he had this little boy, and he showed that, we're not born with fear. We don't know fear. The only reason we learn fear is from observing our parents or people who protect us, or from getting hurt. So, for instance, you won't touch fire because you may touch it and it'll burn you, or because every time you go near the stove, your parents will scream and say, "Oh, don't do that, don't do that." And kids are so in tune to the emotions of their parents that they immediately experience. This is kind of almost like a form of joint attention, right? So if you see your mom experiencing fear without even knowing what it's about, you will have the same feeling. You'll start to fear, and then you'll figure out what it is, right? But our kids on the spectrum, aren't that in tuned to their parents' emotions. So as a result, they're not aware of things like when, how does a child learn to cross the street safely? It's because mom will always say, and which one of us hasn't at one point or another, you'll grab your child's hand really hard. You'll tell them, be careful, watch out, no, always hold my hand. Those types of things are things that give our kids the idea that this is a fear-evoking experience, and I need to be afraid, and being afraid is a signal of safety, right? So I'm cautious, okay? Our kids don't do that. They just walk through because they don't pay attention to us. Right. But teaching fear. So this is what Watson used to do, is he'd have a little child sitting there, a little 1 or 2 year old, and he would be able to, by any object, like for instance a cute little bunny rabbit, which the child loved, by making a very loud sound behind the child when the bunny rabbit came around, then the child would associate that sudden startle to the bunny rabbit, and then would develop fear to the bunny rabbit. Interesting. So one of his main contributions was that you condition fear, right, by attaching it to things that startle us or hurt us, or just evoke fear on their own, unconditioned stimuli. So to answer this question, all you have to do really is find something that does startle your child. Most of the time that'll be a loud sound. Okay. Like for instance, I hate to tell you this, but this is essentially how you do it, especially for something as dangerous as crossing the street. Right. These little things they have that you press and it sounds like a really loud horn. An air horn. Air horn, right. Like that would be a good thing. So the minute he puts his foot down on the curb, or is about to cross or get in front of a car or something like that, then you would press the air horn. That will scare him, but and then he won't do it anymore. But you have to be sure that he is able to overcome that fear by holding your hand or something like that. I mean, I wouldn't recommend doing this unless and especially not at 2. I really wouldn't recommend doing this at 2.
Okay.
But it is something that an ABA professional can easily teach your child when he's, let's say, closer to maybe 6, 7, because at 2, we don't expect our kids to know how to cross the street anyway.
Right.
We don't at 4 anyway. You know, you're always holding your child's hand at least until they're 5 or 6 or even older.
Right.
You know, depending on how protective you are.
Yes.
So I would not really worry about this right now, to be honest, but I do want to assure you that safety can be taught to your child. In fact, you know, one of our staff is really involved with safety way beyond this. This is an easy safety issue, but like he teaches our kids stranger safety, which is a little bit harder to teach.
My son participated in some of the safety protocol things, and it was amazing to see all the different steps of getting him to the point where they did a trial, and somebody approached him. We had it all set up, and there were people watching. I was at home because they knew I couldn't survive it.
Right.
But my husband was there, and they had 3 different therapists watching, so that my husband walked away from my son in a store, and a person who was assigned to be the stranger walked up and tried to
Confederate stranger.
Yes, and tried to get him to go with him, and he passed the test.
That's great.
And you know, absolutely amazing, and because it took many steps to build up to that. But I imagine, you know, and hearing about, I think, you know, hopefully it will help you to not be afraid that this isn't going to be the rest of your life.
Not at all, not at all.
But at this age, at 2, you're going to have to be incredibly on it. And it is amazing to me the different things that autism parents talk about while they begin to work on safety, the measures that they take to ensure that their child is safe while it's being worked on.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, when you talk about, this is one, crossing the street, but I mean, just eloping anywhere. Like, one of the biggest issues for our parents is that the kids don't feel unsafe without them. So they just take off, like in the mall or anywhere public, they'll take off, and that's a big one. Or, you know, chemicals in the house, or all sorts of stuff that we normally worry about, but it does go on a little bit. It's a little bit more intense with kids on the spectrum because they're not paying attention to other people's reactions.
Absolutely. So keeping your child safe but as they progress, and you will be able to teach this.
No question about it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Another question: what age can a child be recovered?
Oh, that's a great question. I can tell you from personal experience, I guess the youngest that I would have recovered would be somewhere around probably 5. And the oldest would be closer to like 12 when I finished.
And so the age at which you started, though, with the 5-year-old,
right, was 2, and with the other boy who went older was 5.
Okay.
So in other words, you know, typically what we believe is that the chances are the highest for kids when they start at around 2 or below 2. I mean, on Thursday I'm seeing a child who's below 2, and I'm like, I'm loving it. I love it whenever I see young kids.
I get so excited when I hear that.
Yeah, I see a lot of kids below 2, but this is actually a second opinion, which is unusual, that I would be the second, you know.
Right.
It's great. But, and so usually that's the case. Our kids are usually the ones that start very, very early, do the best. But I mean, I have had plenty of kids actually who've started closer to 5.
Okay.
And have done very, very well as well.
Okay. Really exciting. And of course, if you're just tuning into the show and have not heard the term recovered in conjunction with autism, I know it's a controversial term. Some people have a problem saying the word recovered and want to say indistinguishable from neurotypical peers. But would you be willing to give us your brief description of what you deem recovered?
Sure. And there's a lot of different reasons people feel this is controversial. I don't want to get stuck in that. I try to ignore that because I've been saying this for God knows how long, and it's still a controversial term. the way that I define recovery here, or we define recovery here at CARD, is first of all, according to our assessments, which are basically skill-based assessments, the child is functioning normally meaning by age level, his own chronological age, in all areas. So areas of functioning like anywhere from language to cognition, executive functioning, social, play, etc., etc. Then we have our kids tested for intelligence, IQ testing, and that has to be normal. And then we also have our kids tested on adaptive skills, the Vineland, which is a great test. Adaptive functioning has to be normal. And we do some additional tests, for instance, test of problem solving, some neuropsych tests where we want to make sure our child's processing speed is normal and their memory is good, and so on and so forth. So all of their standardized testing has to score normal. They don't fit the criteria for ASD or any of the spectrum disorders now, will be a little bit different. And also that they have friends and they are functioning independently in regular education.
Okay. It's a thing that, happens for some of our kids, by no means all of them, but more and more of our kids. And people should know that that is a reality. That is not a unicorn.
It's not
I myself have seen that can happen. And it can happen with a lot of our kids if we get them the right prescription, which is a certain amount of ABA.
Right. And sometimes it takes, some of our kids are just like immediate and sharp kids, like Ethan, who's been on several of our programs. Yeah. He's such a great kid and so obvious, just like, beyond normal. Like one of those kids who's going to be like the captain of the team. And, he's just such a star, and I love that kid. Just so mature.
Yes.
And children like that, it's sort of like, this is their language. And so it's so easy for them, and they pick up and they learn everything, and it just works out great. And other kids, they learn a massive amount in the first few years, and then they take a little bit longer to learn stuff from their environment, so it drags on.
Right.
For instance, you might start at 5, and I think with the other boy that I'm thinking about, 5, we were ongoing until about maybe 8 or 9 or 10 even, with pretty intensive therapeutic hours, and then after that it just became faded out gradually until about 12. So it dragged on for a while, and that was just because the support we provided was less and less and less, and but in the end, everything was done.
Right. All of our kids are different, and it takes different things for different individuals. Right. But recovery can happen. It does happen. We are going to take a short break and come back with more of your questions for Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh. Stick with us. Welcome back to Autism Live and to Ask Dr. Doreen. We have with us here in the studio Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh. She is an expert in the field of autism. We're thrilled to have her here.
Thank you.
She's answering your questions that you're sending in. We have a question that's of a mature nature that we want Dr. Granpeesheh to touch on, but we want to let you all know beforehand that it's of a mature nature, and if you have children in the room that you're concerned about, make sure that you move them to someplace else or lower the volume, or just be forewarned. So a parent who has written in about their 15-year-old autistic son taking off his underwear and playing with himself, and apparently they're concerned about how do they get that to stop in general, but also in terms of, it appears that there's some frequent ejaculation that's happening in their room, and wanting to know how and if to stop that.
Right. And this actually is a pretty common issue for parents when the kids get older, because and it's not really about, it is obviously, it becomes much more about embarrassment and what's appropriate socially and all this sort of stuff as we age, but it's more about, like, really not, it's a deficit in social understanding. It's sort of the individual never really becomes aware of the whole concept of embarrassment. We've talked about this a few times on the show before. So it's a tough thing to deal with when you're dealing with someone who's 15, especially. That's probably one of the toughest ages actually to deal with this, because This is sort of around puberty, and boys are much more likely to be doing this at that age than younger or older. Older it tends to go down as well.
It's actually kind of age appropriate, correct?
It's quite age appropriate, and you know, masturbation for boys can start as early as 2. And it's you know, it's something, it's a reinforcer. I mean, you have to understand that, like, masturbation for a boy, especially because it's so much easier to do, and it's an external organ. It's much different with girls, but with a boy, you basically it is a reinforcer, and it is what we would consider a primary reinforcer. That means it's as strong as food, let's say, you know. I mean, when you want to shape a new behavior or reinforce something new, you would use a primary reinforcer because it's much stronger than social praise or disapproval or anything like that. So it's a very strong reinforcer. It will the only thing that could potentially compete with it is food.
Right.
So therefore, first of all, it's going to be extremely difficult to eliminate, and secondly, it's going to be not necessarily something you want to eliminate, because it will produce a lot of, let's say, calming effects for the boy, and it will allow the child to start to have like some understanding of privacy and of being able to self-soothe, self-calm, and that sort of thing, which is fine. In fact, well, you know, sociologically, if you look at it, Shannon, one of the things that I always say is, like, in general, when you're looking at adults, men and women, men tend to maintain a lot of reinforcers in their universe, whereas women don't. Women's reinforcers change quite significantly. Like when you're a child, you might be playing with dolls or whatever it is, but as you age, your reinforcers become more things like, my children are okay, or I don't have guilt, or, you know, it's more negative reinforcers than actual positive reinforcers. And with men, it's a lot of toys still. It's like, okay, you know, let's play soccer or golf or this or that, and that, you know, they maintain games and toys, whereas women don't. And so men also tend to have just want or seek reinforcement more than women. And so I think this is a circumstance that's similar to that. Now, having said that, it's obviously not appropriate in public. And so one of the things that I would suggest to this parent is, first you should decide, and I highly suggest that you don't necessarily, I mean, this could be your personal beliefs, in which case it's just a little bit tougher, and you would really need professional help, I think, if you wanted to stop this in all environments. What we usually do is we teach our kids very early on that this is something that can only be done in private, and we establish with the family a room or bathroom or whatever where this is appropriate and okay for it to occur. So you would possibly want to find that location first of all, and perhaps you want to look at something like, for instance, which might be easier for your son, and therefore, and also more enjoyable and so on, would be, for instance, when he showers, which is, I think, more typical. And so if you want to do that, then it's something that's a little bit difficult, and if he's 15, I don't know that it would be a good idea for you as a mom to get too involved with this. I do suggest that you try to get a behaviorist. When we do these types of things, we always use our male behaviorists to teach the guys. And then it's just a matter of you can do this in this environment but not in another, and so then it's just a discrimination where you would interrupt and speak sternly for perhaps, or not allow him to do this in his own room or in other, you would just block it. So you would prevent him from taking down his underwear, you would prevent him from initiating, but you would make sure that he understands that all he has to do is stand up, go over and take a shower, and when it's shower time, then he can do this.
Right.
And, you know, another thing that some parents have done is, for instance, you would remove the doors off the bedroom or something. But in this case, it doesn't sound like it would be helpful because he seems to not be really aware of what's going on around him or that there are other people there. So really, I would just try to help him differentiate. One setting it's okay, another setting it's not okay, which means you allow it in one setting, and in the other settings you block it, you prevent it from happening.
Great advice.
And hopefully that will reduce his need enough that it's just not occurring in those settings that make you embarrassed.
Okay, great advice. We're going to take a short break and come back with more questions with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh. Stick with us. Welcome back to Autism Live and Ask Dr. Doreen. Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh is here with us in the studio answering your questions live and in real time. We have a question that came in on the Facebook. How do you help a child who has panic when it rains and worse when it thunders? Living in tropical climate, storms are inevitable.
So this is, it's actually an interesting one because my son used to really panic when it rained. And it's a fear that had developed because he was playing outside and somebody ran inside with him so he wouldn't get wet, and he thought, oh my God, I can never be in rain. Like, I'm going to melt or something. So you know, any fear, the way to deal with fear, any fear, which panic is a type of fear, type of anxiety, is best dealt with through the process of systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization is a process where it involves two different phases, actually 3 phases. So one phase is you take the thing that's evoking the fear, so for instance the thunderstorms or rain, and actually Mom or Dad, whoever wrote, actually lists 2 different things, I think, rain and thunderstorms. So rain appears to be less fear-evoking than thunderstorms for this child. So you'd write a list and you'd write 10 different steps. So the first one, which would be the least fear-evoking, would be perhaps, I don't know, a picture of rain. The second one would be perhaps the sound of rain. The third one might be, I don't know, a video of rain. Fourth one might be video of rain and thunderstorms. I don't know. You have to go from 1 to 10, 10 being the most fear-evoking, such as actually standing outside alone in the middle of a thunderstorm.
Right. Okay,
so that would be number 10, and then you start with 1. You could make it 20 if you wanted to. It's up to you. They're gradients. And then that's phase 1. You've done that list, and for your child, it should be so that your child can really understand it. Ideally, it should be visual or something that your child really gets. So you put this aside for a second. Now the second phase is you teach your child some form of relaxation technique. It could be meditation, it could be, I think they mentioned, I don't know, or maybe another question brought up music. Music is often very, very calming. It could be exercise, you know, deep breathing. We teach our kids breathing and counting. So very basic first for early kids, young kids. We'll just teach them to go 1, 2, you know, like that, and then they'll just breathe through and it'll calm them down. There are many relaxation techniques. You could just look online. I mean, you know, there are things like, I don't know, imagining visual imagery, you know, imagining a very peaceful place or picture or something. There's a million different things, and every child has a different one. And it could be something even like taking a bubble bath or whatever it is that's calming. So, and then the third phase of this whole procedure, desensitization, is pairing those two. So you're conditioning. Remember about a half an hour ago I was talking about how like a loud sound and with the bunny rabbit paired together caused the bunny rabbit to take on the potential of the loud sound and became scary. So this is exactly the reverse of that. So what you're doing is you're taking something that's already fear evoking, like a picture of rain. You start with the lowest picture of rain, and you're pairing it with something that's highly rewarding or are relaxing, and you're pairing them. So you look at a picture of rain and you're taking a warm, nice bubble bath, you're not going to be fearful of the picture of rain anymore. Let's go up and you go one by one. As you master each step, you go to the next one. So let's get to the point where, like, okay, if I'm listening to music and I'm watching something that is like a picture of, or a video of rain and thunder, and mommy's holding my hand, all of this in animal, or maybe I have my stuffed animal, that's not going to be too fear evoking. Okay, or but you make sure that the comfort level stays there. Like it has to be a comfortable situation. So then you could have something like, well, rain is just like taking a shower, really, and what a simulation that would be the closest to being in thunder and rain is perhaps you would have your child put on their rain gear, and then you would have the outside sounds of thunder and rain, and you would actually have the child go in the shower. And so then they realize that this is not really fear evoking, it's not something to be afraid of anymore, and they will get over it. But you essentially have to make sure you're producing some safety, comfort feeling, and you pairing that with each step of that hierarchy and when you can go to the next step when this step has been mastered and the child's no longer fearful of this. So this might take a while, but it's doable. It's very easy it's doable. I've done this. I did this with my son when he was very little, and I did it with a lot of different kids, and it's pretty easy, and you can use it with any phobia, not just rain or something like that. So
can I admit that one of the things that I find really reinforcing about working with my own child this way is how creative we get to be at problem solving.
Oh, totally.
And we get to think outside the box.
Absolutely,
and,
it's a lot of fun.
How many other families say, okay, so today what we're going to do is put on all of our clothes and get in the shower and play a tape of this because we're creating something more positive for our kids.
Absolutely, and the opposite of fear, of course, is laughter. Like if you can get your child to laugh during these experiences, he's not going to have fear. I spent with my son, his fear of water it just generalized. So it was not only just taking a shower, it just generalized to like even swimming, it generalized to going in the ocean, everything. It was massive. It was like he really feared water, period. And one year I remember I had taken him to Maui, and the entire week was this systematic desensitization process. Until the end of the week I could actually get him to go in the ocean. So it's a process, but yeah, it's really rewarding to do that with your kids.
Absolutely. We're going to take a short break and come back with more of your questions. Stick with us. Welcome back to Autism Live during Ask Dr. Doreen. This is when we ask Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, a true expert in the field of autism, your questions. You can be sending them in to us on our live feature or on our Facebook page. Somebody had sent in a comment. I'm a new viewer. My son, age 6, is on the spectrum. Throughout the day, he makes loops out of strings and cords. Anything from shoelaces to phone cords or headsets, even hair strings and jewelry. What should I do to control this behavior as it interferes with his learning at school? I'd like to know what technique to use to diminish or extinguish it in all settings, at home and at school. Any advice is greatly appreciated. I love the jargon that they're using.
Diminish or extinguish.
In all settings. I love it.
Can I just say that I personally hate this one self-stimulatory behavior of twirling string and so on. She says he makes loops with that. Does that mean that he'll take a string, how do you interpret it? That he'll take something and just make loops with it like this? Is that
That's how I would interpret it, but if you're still watching, this was sent in just a couple of minutes ago. If you're still watching, write us in more information about it.
Yeah, if you could let us know, because it's important to know exactly what the behavior is. Regardless, the only way that you can deal with this, because there are so many I guess objects that are string-like, right, in our environment, is that you will need to, in other words, normally I tell you need to prevent it, block it, and it's impossible because there are too many things out there that are like string-like, objects that he could do this with. So really you would assume, we're not going to be sure about this, but we would assume that there's some function that's pleasing to him by him making these loops, and what we're going to try to do is replace that function. So what you would want to do is give him something else that's occupying his fingers or his hands in a way that is contradictory to making loops.
But is reinforcing to him.
Well, it is. I mean, like for instance, anything that he's going to make loops with, or any object that he does this with, it wouldn't be necessarily reinforcing for us,
right.
But for some reason it is for him.
Okay.
And the issue is, what aspect of that is it? Is he tying knots? I don't know. A lot of my kids will just twirl string. I don't know what he's doing. Some of the kids will look at the string as they're moving it. And so I'm not, assuming that he's just making loops with it, like maybe holding it and putting his fingers through it or something. That's a little bit less, let's say, obvious. It's a little bit more benign than a child who also involves his visual self-stimulatory with the string. And I would just try to replace it, because it's just not going to happen. Like, there are too many things in every environment, as you mentioned, and unless you are there's someone with him 24/7, and on his case 24/7, he's just going to find various things to make loops with.
Right.
So the best thing would be to find something more appropriate for him to do. If the parent writes back in, we'll know exactly what it is he's doing. But keep in mind, like in
she says one loop like a twirl.
Right. So that means like taking a string and going like this with it, I assume. But let's say this. So in our culture here in the States, we don't really, I'm trying to think of, what do kids hold in their hands?
She's written in more information.
Okay.
He goes to where the strings are, could be anything, not necessarily do loops like circles, just touch it, usually just plays with it.
Okay. Then what I would say is, and I don't know if this seems odd to you or not, but I did a lot of work in the Middle East for a lot of the royal families all over the Middle East, and we were there many years, very active there. And one of the things that's interesting is that in the Middle East you have these, they're like rosary beads. They're just like rosary beads, right? And after a certain age, all guys are holding on to these rosary beads and they're playing with them non-stop. They're just like holding on to them, and that's their purpose. It is somewhat, I think, a religious also thing in Islam, but it's not really like a rosary bead that you pray to or so on. It's just more something that occupies you. That's the concept that I'm talking about, is if you can find something that would be somewhat appropriate, perhaps, let's say, a keychain, perhaps, let's say, I don't know if it would work with him to have a pen, or a pencil that has maybe string on it. Replace it. Teach him to do something that is less obvious, but yet is just as, I guess, rewarding for him, or just as stimulating. We do so many things ourselves that are normal, that we consider normal, that are very self-stimulatory.
Yeah.
For instance, a lot of people will just hold on to a pen and do this. Like, this would be normal. If I was doing this the whole show, nobody would really worry about it, know, and it would just be part of what I'm doing. So, that's the type of thing I'm talking about. You have to find something that's acceptable in society and perhaps have him do that. Rather than these other things. Because, you're right. And then when he does approach those other objects, you need to stop him and redirect him back to the object or objects that he's able to use. In fact, you could actually give him his own location, like a drawer or a basket or something, where you can place these particular things, like rosary bead type things, or, those bendable pencils. He might really like that. A lot of those types of sensory objects, and every time he goes for something else, you would just redirect him to that location and say, no, you can't go here, go get one of those. and that way he'll start to replace it.
There are so many things to choose from, and there are catalogs that just deal with these kinds of things. And sometimes going to a dollar store, you can find things. They have all those koosh balls that sometimes
totally.
That I've seen kids pulling on those and doing things. But obviously, at 6, at some point, school is going to be a factor, and I would imagine that being able to write. And so I like the idea of the bendable pencil.
Well, and the other thing about it is that sometimes we think with our kids that. Okay, so what I find with some of my kids is that as long as they know, the hardest concept with our kids is when you tell them no, they think they don't realize that they can get to do this a little bit later. It's just no right now.
Yeah.
So in his case, if it starts to interfere with other things like schoolwork and so on, he can always just have the object, let's say a yo-yo or one of those bendable pens, on his desk, and he could learn that he will have access to it as soon as class is over.
Great.
And if it's that meaningful to him, and it sounds like he does take all objects and does this, and if it's that important to him for this, then you'd want to make sure that he knows there are, just like the other question we had, that there are, with masturbation, that there are periods of time where you will be allowed to do this. It's just not now.
Okay.
And having the object in front of you sometimes helps the child be able to control themselves from grabbing at it or going for it somewhere else in the environment. And not that having something like this is going to be, the end all forever and this is all you can do with it, but it is definitely a good first step because it's just too difficult to control when it's something as simple as a string or something. I mean, I look around this room and there's cables and wires and things. There's so many things that are that shape and that type of thing that would stimulate a child. So it's hard.
Absolutely.
It's hard. And I remember I had. You think that's hard. One of the hardest things I had with one of my kids was he was obsessed with touching leaves on a tree, and it was like the most incredibly difficult thing to teach him to stop doing, because how am I going to prevent him from having access to trees?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not within the scope of what's capable. So you got to get around it somehow.
You can't modify the environment, right?
Yeah. Amazing. So patience and really thinking outside the box.
And just trying to replace it. And I would love it if this parent actually kept us informed. Keep telling us what's going on and if you've tried that.
Okay. All right. We have another person who's written in from Chicago, Illinois. I have a 12-year-old autistic son. 12-year-old, and lately he's been sticking his hands down his throat and vomiting several times a day. It's almost as if he's enjoying doing it. And any way we can try to stop this. They're in, as I said, in Chicago, and he continues to write, do we have any resources near Chicago? I am livid at the lack of resources here in Chicago.
We're in Chicago, actually, where I'm not sure exactly what our address is, but we're in Chicago. We have a card office in Chicago.
I want to say it's Oak Park, but that could be wrong.
No, you're right.
Am I? That would be scary if I was right.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
I'm going to look it up right now.
And then I think we're trying to open a second one, actually, in the Naperville area, too. So what I would suggest for that, and we've actually done, so there's a few different things about this process. Obviously, I guess you're preventing it when you can. I guess whenever you see it happening, you're there and you're stopping it. So I'm assuming that the child is doing this when they're alone. And the more you do this, the regurgitation actually, it becomes conditioned and becomes a lot easier over time. So a couple of different things I would say. First of all, we have some publications we did a lot of studies on rumination, and kids get pretty good at kind of regurgitating their food and then sort of munching on it or chewing on it again and swallowing it again, or swishing it around in their mouth and then chewing it again or swallowing. And that can be very, very harmful to them for many, many different reasons. First of all, what you're bringing up is much more acid, and that acid can not only really hurt your throat, your entire inside of your mouth, your tongue, everything, your teeth can erode. I mean, it becomes a problematic type thing, not to mention the fact that you're causing your stomach to work backwards, which is terrible. So we strangely, I don't know how this was something you might want to talk with Jonathan about as well, because he was involved with this study. We found that the best replacement behavior was chewing gum. Strangely, I'm not sure how one of our people came up with that, but it was a great idea.
It's that creativity again.
And it worked.
It.
And so it was a gradual fade in of chewing gum and replacement behavior. And it was funny because for a while there, this was, I think, Denise Ryan, who was at that time managing our Rochester office, and right now she's part of the training team at CART. She was involved with this study, and we used to make fun of it because we'd say, okay, Denise, now all of our kids all over the country who have rumination issues, we're going to send to you because you're an expert in this. But so we could send that study as well to the family if they like, because it does have a step-by-step guide on what to do. Having said that, though, I would do a couple of different things. First of all, I would definitely attempt to replace with some other things, such as gum chewing, which seems to work. But you might want to also get the stuff that they sell out there for kids who bite their fingers. I don't know what it's exactly called, like no bite, bite away, something like that. And I mean, they have it. It's bitter, but yeah, it's it's for stopping biting your fingers, and they have it at all drugstores. And I would put some on the child's fingers just because the child will then stop trying to. I think the parent had said the child puts their finger down their throat. Yes. So the child will hopefully stop doing that to begin with. And then, of course, what you would do is you'd have a non-contingent schedule. So you'd actually want to make sure that for the first few days, your child has access to chewing gum pretty constantly. That is, and I think that will only work if the rumination part of it is what's the reinforcing part of it.
Right.
So on the one hand, you're blocking it because the finger will taste bad, and on the other hand, you're replacing it with something that's appropriate, chewing gum, and that will most likely eliminate that behavior. It's a tough one, but it is an easy one to eliminate. It's not as hard. Especially
with professional help, I would assume, in this particular case.
Yeah, and all of these things that I suggest, for me, it's a natural thing. I'm a behavior analyst, a psychologist. I've been doing this for my whole life. Yeah. And even for me, when I did it, different things with my own kids, or if I always want to make sure that I'm like consulting with someone else or getting some expertise in there. I think it's helpful. And I think in some cases, probably you have your hands full with maybe other kids or life or whatever, as we all do. And if you have access to other professionals, I would really seriously recommend it. We can help with this. We do still, people don't realize that we still do provide our sort of what we used to call SOS services, specialized outpatient services. All you really have to do is call our Chicago office.
I've got the number right here. It is Oak Park. They can call the 800 number to start.
That's probably best.
And that's the 855-345-2273. But I'll also give the Chicago office number if you want to call and ask questions. It's 708-358-3000. And again, that's in Oak Park. It's on Marion Street in Oak Park. So if you're in the Chicago area, you should be close enough to qualify for services there.
Right.
And it is a state that has insurance reform, so there's at least a 50% chance that it would be covered by your insurance.
Right. And our operations manager there is Marisol, and so you can ask for Marisol and you can talk to her. And just make sure you tell her that you brought this up to me on Autism Live. And then what she'll do is she'll probably email me because she won't know what I'm talking about. And then I'll refer her back to the research group and we'll get some documents together for you. But then also if you need, if you actually want someone to help, then of course we have supervisors there who can assist you, and you would just go in, they would either train you how to do it or they would officially do it for you and use our staff to do that.
Okay, great advice. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions here.
Sure.
When a child has an extreme fear and or reaction, screaming and crying towards people, particularly with men, would this be a deficit in social interaction under the new criteria? So not asking how to solve it. Not asking how to solve it, but does this count? I'm wondering if they're trying to see, does my child qualify? Does this qualify as a social deficit?
Yeah, it would in my mind, because anything that prevents you from behaving appropriately socially would be considered a social deficit. Okay. But, you know, it's just, so yeah, it's a phobia. And if you have phobias, that would be considered and they are detrimental to the point that they prevent you from, let's say, having a male teacher or having male therapists or going to a gym where there are men or whatever. I mean, obviously it can be pretty detrimental depending on how severe it is. So yeah.
Okay. And then we've already talked a little bit in the show about how we can overcome these things, but just answering the question, yes, it would more than likely be considered deficit in social interaction. Next question. My 4-year-old has autism and he's high functioning. He is currently obsessed with his toy trains and stims with them by watching the wheels and by repetitively moving them back and forth. Yeah. He will do this as much as he can. Should I remove them all together, or what would Dr. Doreen suggest?
Yeah, I would probably at this point remove them all together unless there's someone there who can actually teach him how to play. And this is very, very common with our kids. A lot of our kids, when they first come in, the play with cars is like this, you know, where they're looking at the wheels, or it's like this, where they're turning the wheels. And that is repetitive, rote, stereotypical behavior, self-stimulatory behavior, and we stop it. And every time the child does that, we just simply say, no, play with it right, and put it on the ground and start to teach pretend play and actual play going up and down bridges and roads and so on and so forth. So unless there's someone there, I would try to get rid of things with wheels just for now. The whole concept with self-stimulatory stuff is it becomes so rote that the child is so ingrained in doing that they are not paying attention to anything else in the environment. So that's why you sort of want to reduce those types of things, because you want the child to have attention and access to everything in their environment. If a child does that, by the way, they're probably also going to be staring at ceiling fans, anything that goes around in circles and so on. So you just have to be aware of that. And again, you know, we don't know yet from a sensory perspective why some of our kids are so interested in things that are circular motion. Some of our kids, we don't know. And so having said that, you know, if the child is able to minimize their need to do these types of things to very, very discrete periods of time that are limited and they're easily redirectable, excuse me. So in other words, they're not spending their whole day doing this, then I would say you don't stress out about it too much, because it's fulfilling some need that we're not sure about yet. But if it starts to prevent the child from paying attention to anything else, if the child gets upset when you try to interrupt this pattern, if the child would rather do this than look at a person or interact with a person, then yeah, you would want to try to eliminate that.
Okay. I've got 2 more questions I want to get in, but sure. I'm going to squeeze one more in. My son is 14 with ASD and is in grade 9, mainstream with some support in language arts. During the day, he is able to function with minimum to no stimming. However, once he gets home, he tends to go to his room or the restroom and goes ballistic, hand flapping and stimming a lot for a good 30 minutes. Should I just let it happen, or what else can I do?
Wow. That's kind of an interesting situation.
Yeah.
So the child is 14 and
ASD,
school,
grade 9, mainstream.
Grade 9.
Only support in language arts. Is functioning well during the day.
Right. Well, why don't... please let me know the answer to this.
Okay.
Why don't you ask him why he needs to do that? Just ask him, why do you need that half hour? What are you doing? What does the hand flapping produce for you? It seems to me that it's a wind down of some type. If it's only for half an hour after school, it's still not something that I'd want to ignore for a child who's, you know, in a mainstream, so close to typical development. I still wouldn't want to just let it go. I'd question and I'd say, why do you do this, and what does it do for you? And perhaps you might want to suggest some other activities that would have similar calming effect, like depending on where you live. I don't know, like swimming tends to be a wind down activity for kids. Gym type stuff like a trampoline. And again, what you're doing is you're kind of taking dancing. I mean, a lot of movement in dancing ends up looking like self-stimulatory behavior if you really think about it.
I never thought about it before, but yes.
It really is. So it's a matter of just taking what he's doing and turning it into some activity that could be classified as sort of appropriate. Maybe, you know, painting on a large easel or wall or something would involve the... It's just you don't want to... You know, if you ignore it right now as he gets into the age and starts like getting friends, and it'll start looking odd to his friends, and it'll be a secret he has to keep, and it'll start to isolate him from his community and his peers. So I wouldn't just ignore it, but at the same time, I think if he's that high functioning, I would just go and ask him, like, why do you do this? What does it do for you? Does it calm you? And then I would suggest other things that might be a little bit less odd appearing.